Okay, so here's a number that should stop you cold. Building a single German Tiger tank took somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 man-hours of skilled labor. Building a single American Sherman took roughly 10,000. That's not a small gap. That's a factory that could turn out 20 to 30 Shermans in the time it took a German plant to finish one Tiger. And the strange part is, neither side was being lazy or incompetent. Both were running exactly the factory their national economy had built them to run. The tank on the battlefield gets all the attention. The factory behind it is where the war actually got decided. And the economics of that factory floor turn out to be a genuinely fascinating story on their own. The cost gap tracks the labor gap almost exactly. A Tiger costs somewhere around $320,000 in contemporary dollar equivalent terms to produce. A Chrysler-built Sherman came in at a contract price of about $33,500, roughly a tenth of the price, for a tank that could be repaired, replaced, and put back into the fight within days instead of months. Neither number tells you which tank would win a straight duel. Both numbers tell you, with brutal clarity, which side could actually afford to keep fighting once the losses started piling up. Beat. Building the factory before you build a single tank. Before the United States could mass produce a single tank, it needed somewhere to actually do it, and in 1940 that place didn't exist yet. The government turned to Chrysler and to industrial architect Albert Kahn, the same man who'd go on to design 20 million square feet of American defense plants that year alone, to build the country's first purpose-built tank factory from scratch. The Detroit Arsenal, on 113 acres of former farmland just north of the city. The pace of construction was almost absurd. Workers were still raising walls and pouring concrete when the first M3 tank rolled off the line on April 24, 1941, months before the building was actually finished. By the war's end, that single plant, built essentially overnight, had produced roughly a quarter of every tank the United States manufactured during the entire conflict. Compare that to Germany's approach, which never really had an equivalent build the factory first moment at all. German tank production stayed spread across dozens of separate contractors and subcontractors well into the war, each running its own smaller, more specialized workshop rather than one centralized mass production complex. It's the same fundamental split you'd see comparing a single Class A shopping mall, purpose-built around a unified plan, to a scattered collection of independent local shops, each doing things its own way. One model scales, the other doesn't, no matter how skilled any individual shop happens to be. Beat. Two completely different philosophies for the assembly line itself. Here's where the actual production numbers start to explain themselves. The Detroit Arsenal ran tanks down 3 parallel automotive-style assembly lines, laid out in vast, orderly halls, supported by roughly 8,000 machine tools, precision equipment that let relatively less skilled workers perform narrow, repeatable tasks at speed. The same logic Henry Ford had already proven on the automobile line decades earlier. A German Tiger, by contrast, was built at a plant with barely 1,000 machine tools, using a process that looked far more like aircraft manufacturing than automobile assembly. The tank stayed in one place while teams of highly skilled workers performed different stages of construction on it in sequence, with substantial hand-fitting and rework required at nearly every step, because German production had never fully standardized its parts and tolerances across suppliers the way American and Soviet lines had. That single design choice, mass tooling, plus lightly trained labor versus minimal tooling plus highly skilled labor, is the entire explanation behind that 200,000 versus 10,000 man-hour gap. It wasn't that German workers were slower or less capable individually. It's that the German system asked far more of each individual worker's specialized skill and far less of the machinery around them, which meant every single tank effectively had to be hand-built almost from scratch, the way a bespoke tailor builds one suit at a time instead of running a garment factory. Beat. The Soviet answer. Sacrifice everything except the parts that kill Germans. If the American approach was tooling heavy and the German approach was skill heavy, the Soviet approach to tank production was something else entirely, brutally, deliberately stripped down to whatever actually mattered on a battlefield, and nothing else. Soviet engineers spent 1941 through 1943 systematically simplifying the T-34, removing more than 5,600 individual parts from the design and simplifying another 770. Not for elegance, but purely to cut man-hours and material off the production line. The results showed up directly in the price tag. A T-34 cost roughly 269,000 rubles to build in 1941, and by 1943, that same tank doing the same job cost about 135,000. The price cut in half through nothing but relentless simplification and the learning curve of workers repeating the same operations thousands of times over. Cosmetic finish, interior comfort, and manufacturing tolerances that didn't affect the gun, the armor, or the engine were treated as complete afterthoughts. Welds didn't need to be pretty. They needed to hold. And the Soviets paid for that simplicity with a workforce composition that would have been unthinkable in an American or German factory. At the Chelyabinsk tractor plant, nicknamed Tankograd, Tank City, the workforce swelled from 21,000 people in 1937 to 60,000 by 1944, and the overwhelming majority of those workers were women, teenagers, and elderly men, mobilized to replace the men who'd gone to the front, working 11 and 12-hour shifts in conditions described as hot, smoky, cramped, and dimly lit. It was, in effect, the exact opposite trade of the German factory. Instead of asking a small number of highly skilled workers to hand-build a complicated machine, the Soviet system asked an enormous number of minimally trained workers to repeatedly build an aggressively simplified one. Workers were also organized into what the Soviets called Komsomol Youth Front Brigades, teams, often started by women who'd come to replace fathers and brothers sent to fight, where every member deliberately cross-trained on 2 or 3 different machines simultaneously so that a single illness, injury, or death on the line wouldn't stall an entire station. It was labor organization built around the explicit assumption that the workforce itself would take casualties, almost like a military unit, and needed the same kind of redundancy a military unit builds into its own ranks. Beat. The hidden trap. What happens when the factory itself has to run for its life? Here's the structural risk hiding underneath the entire Soviet production story. And it's a genuinely different flavor of crisis than anything the mall or the U-boat economics faced, because in this case, the factory itself, not just the product, was the thing under direct attack. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, its advancing armies were driving directly toward the Western Soviet Union's major tank plants, the Kharkov Locomotive Factory, the Leningrad Kirov Works, dozens of supporting component plants. The Soviet response was one of the largest industrial relocations in human history. Entire factories, machine tools, and all dismantled, loaded onto trains, and shipped thousands of kilometers east to the Ural Mountains, out of reach of the advancing front. The Kharkov plant alone required 43 separate trains to move. Only about 10% of its original workforce and 20% of its engineers actually made the full journey east with the machinery. The rest were lost to the chaos of evacuation, conscription, or simply the war itself. What awaited the machinery on arrival was, by any normal industrial standard, not a functioning factory at all. At Nizhny Tagil, where the Kharkov plant's equipment was unloaded in the dead of winter, parts of the new facility didn't even have a roof yet, in temperatures that dropped to -40 degrees. And yet, in December 1941, in the middle of that half-built, unheated shell of a building, the first 25 relocated T-34s rolled off the line anyway. At the Stalingrad tractor factory, the situation got even more extreme. As German forces closed in on the city in 1942, freshly built tanks reportedly rolled straight off the assembly line, still unpainted, and drove directly to the front lines a few miles away. The factory manufacturing its own last line of defense in real time, before being evacuated yet again. This is the exact same structural lesson as a co-tenancy clause buried in a mall lease. Just wearing military clothing, the entire production system had a single point of failure: the physical location of the factory. And when that failure hit, it didn't just slow output, it threatened to erase the entire production base overnight. The Soviet Union survived that specific trap only because it was willing to pay an almost unimaginable cost in speed, safety, and human suffering to physically relocate the factory itself faster than the front line could catch up to it. It's worth sitting with just how close that margin actually was. The relocation of a single major tank plant meant coordinating tens of thousands of tons of heavy machinery, an entire skilled workforce, and every scrap of raw material inventory across thousands of kilometers of an overloaded wartime rail network. While the Wehrmacht was actively advancing toward the same city the trains were trying to leave. Get that timing wrong by even a few weeks, and the machinery, the blueprints, and the accumulated manufacturing know-how simply falls into enemy hands or gets destroyed outright. The Soviet Union effectively ran the riskiest, highest-stakes logistics operation of the entire war, not to move troops or supplies to the front, but to save its own factories from ceasing to exist at all. Beat. Why Germany's scattered model wasn't purely a mistake either. It would be easy to conclude Germany's decentralized artisanal production model was simply worse in every respect. And mostly it was. But it did carry one genuine, if grim, advantage that the concentrated American and Soviet models didn't share. Because German tank production was spread across dozens of smaller, geographically scattered contractors, rather than concentrated in a handful of massive complexes, it was, in a strange way, more resistant to being knocked out entirely by a single bombing raid. Destroy one component supplier, and production slowed at a handful of assembly points. It didn't stop entirely, the way wiping out a single Detroit arsenal or a single Tankograd complex might have crippled an entire nation's tank output in one strike. The problem was that this resilience came bundled with the exact same low-volume, high-man-hour inefficiency that made German tanks so slow and expensive to build in the first place. Germany essentially built a production system that was hard to kill, but also never capable of producing at anywhere near the scale its opponents could sustain. It's the industrial equivalent of a Tiger tank itself, individually harder to destroy, but never available in remotely the numbers that mattered. Once the war became a contest of who could put more machines on the field faster than the other side could remove them. There's a version of this trade-off that shows up constantly in business, stripped of the wartime stakes. A network of small, independent boutiques is genuinely harder to wipe out with one bad decision than a single centralized flagship store. but it will also never match that flagship's economies of scale on a good day. Germany, whether by strategic choice or simple industrial habit, built up over decades of smaller specialized workshops, ended up running the boutique model in a war that was increasingly being decided by whoever could run the flagship model at the largest possible scale. Beat. What the whole comparison actually reveals, run the totals side by side and the outcome stops being surprising at all. The Detroit Arsenal alone, a single American factory, built more tanks than Germany's entire scattered production network combined. Tankograd and its sister Ural plants, running on a workforce of teenagers and grandmothers in unheated buildings, outproduced Germany's skilled specialized workshops by a margin that made the individual superiority of any single German tank almost beside the point. By the time the war ended, the Soviet Union alone had built well over 35,000 T-34s from new production, and American factories, once fully ramped, were turning out close to 30,000 armored fighting vehicles in a single year. None of this means the engineering itself didn't matter. The T-34's sloped armor and the Sherman's reliability were both genuinely good designs, not just cheap ones. But the deeper truth sitting underneath every one of these numbers is the same one that kept surfacing across every branch of this war's economics. The tank was never really the product. The factory that built it, the machine tools standing behind it, and the sheer number of ordinary people willing to run 11-hour shifts in a half-built building in the middle of a Ural winter. That was the actual weapon. And it turned out to be a weapon Germany's more skilled, more artisanal, more individually impressive production system simply couldn't match at any price. Put the three national approaches side by side one final time, and the pattern is almost too clean. Germany bet on the individual skill of the craftsman. America bet on the machine tool standing behind an averagely trained worker, and the Soviet Union bet on stripping the product down to its bare essential function and multiplying an enormous minimally trained workforce against it. Only one of those three bets was actually built to survive losing its own factories to enemy advance mid-war, and it happened to be the bet that looked, on paper, the least sophisticated of the three. If a factory rebuilt in the snow with no roof just rewired how you think about who actually wins a war, send this to someone who still argues tank-for-tank spec sheets. And subscribe. Every week, another system whose real logic was hiding in the numbers the whole time.